They called him Dad, at his own funeral. 2 boys in pressed white shirts, holding trembling hands, standing next to a woman I had never seen before. The sound didn't register at first. I thought perhaps they'd mistaken someone else. Perhaps they were lost or confused. Perhaps grief had made me imagine things. But when the older one spoke again, Dad always loved that song. Something inside me shifted, a tiny click in the machinery of the world, quiet but irreversible, like the soft sound a lock makes just before it closes for good. I turned my head toward them, and the sight was both ordinary and impossible. They looked like him, not in the vague way people often claim children resemble the dead, but truly, unmistakably, his brow, the way their hair fell over their foreheads, even the nervous habit of pressing their lips together as though words were a risky business. They looked like the life I thought I knew, rewritten by a stranger's hand. It's strange, the mind's reflex to protect itself. I remember thinking absurd things, that they should have worn darker shoes, that the younger one's collar was too tight, that the woman beside them was standing too close to the casket, too familiar. Then I heard someone whisper, "That must be her," and the air inside the chapel turned heavy, perfumed with lilies and disbelief. I wanted to stand, to ask who she was, but my body had already made a different choice. It went still. Stillness is its own kind of survival. I've learned that with age. I am 78 now, and the body knows things before the mind can bear them. For 52 years, I was Derek Grant's wife. I signed my name beside his on mortgage papers, birthday cards, medical forms, and once, long ago, on a marriage certificate that promised partnership and honesty until death. Death came, as promised, but honesty did not. I live alone now, in the same small house by the coast where he brought me on our honeymoon. The sea hasn't changed much, still restless, still gray in the mornings. But I have. I no longer measure time in days or seasons, but in the distance between what I believed and what turned out to be true. That distance is vast, wider than the ocean that pounds against my windows at night. At the funeral, I sat in the front row, the seat reserved for the widow, the seat of honor and pity. People touched my shoulder with practiced sympathy, told me how loved I must have been, how lucky I was to have shared such a long life with him. I nodded, smiled when expected, accepted condolences like ritual offerings I could not refuse. No one noticed the small family seated near the back, no one except me. The woman kept her eyes lowered, her hand on the boy's shoulder, protective yet uncertain, as if she wasn't sure whether she had the right to be there. Later, when the pastor asked if anyone wished to speak, she didn't stand, but the older boy did. His voice trembled only slightly as he said, "My dad used to tell me that courage isn't loud. It's the quiet thing you do when nobody sees." He said it simply, without drama, and the congregation sighed collectively, charmed by innocence, unaware of the grenade he'd just dropped into my life. When the service ended, I watched them move through the crowd. Some people smiled at them, thinking perhaps they were cousins or family friends, but I saw the careful distance in her movements, the way she avoided looking at me, the slight flinch when someone mentioned Derek's name. I waited near the steps of the church because I needed to confirm what my heart already knew. The sun was mercilessly bright, that obscene kind of light that exposes every wrinkle, every flaw, every truth. The woman approached slowly, as though walking into confession. "Mrs. Grant," she said. Her voice was soft, educated, polite. "I'm sorry for your loss." The line was practiced, but her eyes were restless, darting to the boys who were now chasing each other between gravestones. I wanted to ask who she was, but my throat betrayed me. She seemed to understand anyway. "I thought you knew," she whispered, not cruelly, just sadly, like someone delivering news that had already been delayed too long. Then she touched her necklace, a small silver pendant I had never seen before, but recognized instantly. I'd bought one just like it for Derek on our 30th anniversary, engraved on the back, "Yours always." He'd told me he lost it on a business trip. I didn't collapse. That would have been theatrical, and I have never been a woman of theatrics. Instead, I turned toward the road, thanked her for her words, and walked to my car with the calm precision of someone crossing a frozen lake, one careful step at a time. Inside, with the door closed and the air suffocatingly still, I waited for the sob that never came. Grief and betrayal make strange bedfellows. They crowd each other out. One cannot breathe while the other survives. I drove home with both hands steady on the wheel, the funeral program fluttering on the passenger seat like an accusation. The house was exactly as we'd left it before he fell ill. His reading glasses still on the side table, his mug in the sink, the half-finished crossword folded neatly on the armrest. Everything waiting for a man who would never come back. I remember thinking how well he had trained me to maintain appearances. The curtains open at 9, the mail sorted, the plants watered, the illusion intact. Even in death, he managed to keep his secrets dignified. I walked through the room slowly, touching objects as if they might explain themselves. The smell of his aftershave lingered in the air, that sharp masculine scent I once found comforting. Now it felt intrusive, like an uninvited guest. Later that night, I sat at the kitchen table with the lights off, listening to the refrigerator hum and the sea beyond the window, the two sounds merging into something that resembled thought. I tried to recall the last time Derek had looked at me and I'd truly seen him, not the dutiful glances, not the shared routines of aging, but a real look, one human being to another. I couldn't remember. What I did remember was the slow, quiet erosion of intimacy that I had mistaken for comfort. When love fades gradually, it doesn't feel like loss. It feels like maturity, like peace. But peace built on ignorance is just silence, wearing a polite dress. People talk about betrayal as if it happens in an instant, like a door slamming or a confession shouted in anger. It doesn't. It accumulates. It hides in small habits. The late nights, the guarded phone calls, the way he'd flinch when I entered the room unexpectedly. Looking back, the signs were everywhere, but I was too loyal or too afraid to read them. We had built a life that looked complete from the outside. Dinners with friends, Christmas cards, the golden couple of our street. Inside, we lived parallel lives that barely touched. I had become his witness, not his partner, and still, I thought that counted for something. That night, after the funeral, I went through his study. The drawers were meticulously organized, as though he'd anticipated inspection. But even the most careful man forgets something. In the back of the lowest drawer, beneath old tax forms, I found a small photograph. 2 children on a beach, the younger holding a plastic spade, the older wearing a sun hat far too big for his head. Between them stood Derek, laughing, wind in his hair, alive in a way I hadn't seen in years. On the back, a note in his handwriting, Summer, 2017. My boys. I read it twice, the words dissolving as though printed on water. He had written my boys, not our, not friends' children. The casual ownership in that pronoun was devastating. I sat there for a long time, the photograph trembling in my hands, until I realized the shaking wasn't from grief, but from recognition. This was my handwriting too, in a sense, the story of my marriage written over his in invisible ink, the secrecy, the half-truths, the gentle evasions. We had lived in polite deceit long before he ever met her. His betrayal was just the final act of a play we'd both agreed to perform. The difference was that he'd found a new audience. When dawn came, I made tea, not because I wanted it, but because it was what I had always done. The ritual steadied me. Steam rose from the cup like a quiet spirit, and I thought of the woman at the funeral, the way she had looked at me, not with triumph, but with pity. That was the worst part. I could have forgiven her contempt, but pity is unbearable. Pity says, "You didn't even know what game you were playing." Outside, the tide was coming in. The waves hit the rocks with that steady, unhurried violence that only the sea understands. For a moment, I felt an odd kinship with it. We both keep eroding the same shore, again and again, pretending it's still ours. I sat at the window until the sky turned pink, the photograph lying open beside my cup. I didn't cry, though the body wanted to. Instead, I whispered something I hadn't said in years. Enough. That word hung in the kitchen air like a promise. I didn't know then what it meant, only that something inside me had shifted, the same way the tide shifts just before it turns. I was still his widow, still the woman everyone would see as tragic and dignified, but underneath, a new silence was forming. Not the silence of ignorance, but the silence of awakening, heavy and alive, waiting to speak. The day after the funeral, I woke up to a silence so dense it felt almost solid, a silence that seemed to press against the walls and crawl beneath the doors, thick with the weight of something unsaid. The phone had already begun its expected performance of condolences. Neighbors, cousins, old colleagues of Derek, who wanted to remind me of his decency, his laughter, his supposed devotion, but I let them all go to voicemail. There was nothing they could tell me that I hadn't already learned in that single word. Dad, spoken by a boy who carried my husband's eyes. I sat in my kitchen with the newspaper unopened, the kettle cooling beside me, and I realized that for the first time in 52 years, I had no idea what the day required of me. For half a century, my life had been choreographed by his rhythms, his morning coffee, his meetings, his moods, and now the script had vanished. It should have felt like freedom, but it felt instead like vertigo, the sudden awareness of how small my world had become inside the orbit of one man's shadow. It was late morning when the doorbell rang. Through the frosted glass, I saw a shape, female, slender, motionless. I hesitated before opening it, some primitive part of me already knowing. When I finally turned the handle, the woman from the funeral stood there, the one who had said, "I thought you knew." She wore a navy coat buttoned too tightly, her hair pulled back as if neatness could substitute for composure. She looked like a person rehearsing restraint. "Mrs. Grant," she said again, quieter now. "I'm sorry for coming unannounced. I didn't know what else to do." Behind her, at the edge of the walkway, the younger boy waited, kicking at a pebble, bored, unaware that he was standing on the fault line between two lives. I could have closed the door. I didn't. I stepped aside, and she entered like someone entering a church, careful, reverent, afraid to make noise. We sat at the kitchen table, the same one where Derek had eaten his breakfast every morning, reading the paper, making jokes about the headlines. She glanced around the room, her gaze catching on details only a woman would notice. The framed photographs, the second mug on the counter, the faint smell of aftershave that still lingered near the hallway. "You kept it very much the same," she said absently, as if remarking on a museum exhibit. I wanted to ask what she meant, but she continued before I could. "My name is Laura," she said, and her hands, pale and thin, clasped together on the table as if she were confessing. We met when I was working at the clinic where he went for his checkups. It wasn't supposed to happen. He said you were unwell, that he didn't want to worry you. The words arrived in slow motion, each one landing gently, mercilessly, like snowflakes that still manage to bury everything they touch. I listened, not interrupting, because interruptions are for people who still believe they can change the story being told. She spoke of years spent waiting for promises, of meetings in hotels only when it was safe, of how Derek had planned to tell me when the time was right. He had, she said, wanted to make sure his family was protected, that I wouldn't suffer. I almost laughed at that, but my throat was too tight. Protecting me, what a generous word for hiding me from the truth. He was afraid of hurting you, she said, and I found myself answering with a calm I didn't recognize. Then he shouldn't have chosen a life that required cowardice. Her eyes filled, but she didn't argue. There was something sincere in her sadness, something too ordinary to hate. We were both women who had loved the same man, and neither of us had received the version of him we were promised. The boy wandered into the kitchen then, holding a small model car. "Mom, can we go soon?" he asked. He had Derek's voice, the same pitch, the same abruptness when he wanted something. It pierced through me more effectively than any confession. I asked him how old he was. 12, he said. My birthday was in March. Derek's birthday had been in March, too. The arithmetic of betrayal is simple, brutal, undeniable. I nodded and forced a smile, but my mouth refused to cooperate fully. Your father loved cars, I said, just to fill the space. The boy grinned. Yeah, he said he used to race when he was young. That was true, at least. Some facts survived deceit. He ran back to the garden, leaving the echo of Derek's laughter behind him like a ghost that didn't know where to go. Laura set a small envelope on the table. He wanted me to give you this if anything ever happened, she said. I stared at it for a long time, unwilling to touch it. The envelope was unsealed, just my name written on it in his neat, slanted handwriting. Elaine. Inside, a single page folded in half. No greeting, no apology, just one sentence. There are things I couldn't tell you without losing you. That was all. Not even a signature. The cowardice of the incomplete. I folded it back and slid it into the drawer with the utility bills. I didn't want to see it again, but I couldn't throw it away either. Some lies deserve a proper burial. Laura started to cry then, quietly, like someone ashamed of still having tears left. He said he couldn't live two lives forever, she murmured. But I think he wanted to die before he had to choose. I didn't comfort her. I wasn't cruel, but I had nothing left to offer. My sympathy was spent on the years he stole from me. You don't owe me explanations, I said, and she shook her head. I know, but I owe myself the truth. That line stayed with me long after she left. We are all accountants of pain, tallying what we owe and what's owed to us. When the door finally closed behind her, the silence returned, but it was no longer empty. It was charged, trembling. I walked through the house, touching things, as if to confirm their existence. On Derek's desk, I found another photograph, one I hadn't noticed before. A woman's hand holding an infant's, only the hand, delicate, manicured. On the back, his handwriting again, March 2011. My miracle. The date matched perfectly with the boy's age. I placed the photo face down and leaned against the desk, the wood cold beneath my palms. I remembered that same month, March 2011, when Derek told me he was traveling for a conference in Denver, when I stayed behind to care for my sister who was dying. While I was learning the sound of morphine pumps and the slow breathing of the nearly dead, he was starting another life in a rented apartment with fresh paint and new laughter. It's strange how betrayal can exist in the same timeline as grief, how one sorrow can conceal another. That night, I dreamed of a hallway lined with doors. Behind each door was a year of our marriage, and I walked through them one by one. 1972, the year we bought the house. 1984, when he forgot our anniversary. 1996, when he said he might take early retirement but didn't. 2005, when he began locking his phone. The hallway stretched endlessly until I reached the last door, 2011. And when I opened it, I saw the woman from the funeral holding a newborn. Derek stood beside her, smiling, his hand resting lightly on her shoulder. I tried to speak, but the air inside the dream had turned to glass. I woke up drenched in sweat, my mouth tasting of salt. In the morning, I went to the lawyer's office to discuss the estate. The young man behind the desk had that crisp, professional sympathy reserved for widows of means. He explained that Derek's accounts were straightforward, that the house and savings would pass to me as expected, but there was also a trust. A small one, he said, glancing at his notes, for a beneficiary named Thomas Reynolds. I asked him to repeat the name. He did, spelling it out carefully, unaware of what he was revealing. I could see the exact moment realization flickered across his face. "Oh," he said, his tone changing. "I suppose you knew about that." I smiled politely, the kind of smile women use when they are bleeding internally. "Of course," I said. "He mentioned it once." Outside, the sunlight was too bright again, the air thick with the smell of cut grass and gasoline. I stood on the sidewalk holding the folder of papers and thought about how easily the world continues after revelation. Cars still pass, dogs still bark, people still go about their errands, unaware that someone among them has just learned her entire life was built on borrowed truths. I walked aimlessly for a while, past shop windows and unfamiliar faces, until I found myself standing in front of the sea. It was low tide, the sand wet and shining like metal. I sat on a bench and watched the waves retreat, pulling back the foam as if erasing their own evidence. That was when the first tear finally came. Not a sob, not a collapse, just one tear sliding down without permission. I wiped it away quickly, almost angrily, because even then I couldn't bear to give him the satisfaction of seeing me weep, even from the grave. When I returned home, I opened the drawer and took out the letter he'd written. I read it again, slower this time, searching for subtext. There are things I couldn't tell you without losing you. The arrogance of that line, the assumption that his silence was mercy rather than cowardice. I tore the paper in half, then again, until the pieces were small enough to fit in my palm. I scattered them into the sink and turned on the tap, watching them dissolve into pulp. The drain swallowed his last words, leaving only the hiss of water. For the first time in days, I exhaled fully. It didn't feel like forgiveness. It felt like the beginning of something else, something without his name attached to it. That night, before bed, I wrote a single sentence in my journal, the first entry since his illness began. The truth arrived late, but it arrived. Then I closed the book, turned off the light, and lay in the dark, listening not to the emptiness beside me, but to the faint sound of the sea beyond the window, constant and indifferent. I thought of the boy, the one who had called him Dad, and I wondered if he knew yet that love can be the cruelest disguise for betrayal. I hoped he would learn it sooner than I did. The days that followed had the texture of fog, thick, disorienting, neither night nor day, but some gray in between that refused to let me see where I was heading. I moved through the house like an intruder, touching objects that no longer belonged to me, opening drawers as though I might find a map back to the life I used to recognize. The mornings were the worst. I would wake up expecting the small sounds that had always defined my existence. The soft whistle of the kettle, the creak of the front step as Derek fetched the newspaper, the faint hum of the radio tuned to the local weather. Instead, there was only the wind pushing against the windows, the hollow echo of nothing happening. I thought I would feel relief at his absence, but what I felt instead was humiliation. A sharp, cold awareness that while I had been performing the role of loyal wife, another woman had been living the part of secret truth. Even the sea outside seemed to mock me, rolling in and out with the steady rhythm of a world that never loses its appetite for repetition. In grief, people expect you to crumble. They bring casseroles and cheap flowers, murmur about God's plan, offer you rides to church. What no one prepares you for is the quiet absurdity of being betrayed by a dead man. There is no confrontation, no apology, no explanation to dissect or forgive. There is only an empty chair at the kitchen table and a stack of bills with his name still printed neatly in the corner. On the third day after Laura's visit, I decided I could no longer sit in the house surrounded by ghosts of domestic order. I gathered the bank statements, the tax documents, the remnants of our financial life, and spread them across the dining table. Paper became my battleground. I wanted numbers, proof, something factual to hold on to because feelings had become untrustworthy. The longer I looked, the clearer the pattern became. Monthly transfers to a separate account, one I had never seen before, always on the same date, always labeled with a discreet note: support, supplies, school. At first I told myself it could be charity. Derek was known to donate quietly to small causes, but then I found an email printed and folded among the receipts, a brief message from him to a woman named Elle, confirming the transfer and mentioning the child's school fees. The signature line read simply, "Love, D." The world did not tilt or shatter. It simply shrank. That is the true cruelty of betrayal. It doesn't explode. It contracts. The space you thought was yours becomes smaller, tighter, until you can hardly breathe. I sat there for hours, tracing the ink on the paper with my finger, trying to imagine the version of Derek who had typed those words, who had juggled accounts and excuses and lies so deftly that not once did I suspect. Perhaps I did suspect, I thought then, but I learned early that suspicion in a marriage is treated like hysteria when voiced by a woman. Better to be silent and respectable than right and alone. So I had stayed silent, and now I was both. That afternoon I walked down to the shoreline. The wind was sharp, lifting the edges of my coat, filling my lungs with salt. In front of me, the water stretched endless and pitiless, as if daring me to keep looking for meaning. I had lived by this sea for half a century and had never really seen it. Derek used to say it calmed him, that the tides reminded him of constancy, but all I could think now was how the waves never apologize for returning to the same shore after destroying it. I picked up a stone, smooth and gray, and threw it as far as I could. It sank instantly. I almost envied it, that clean surrender to depth. When I returned home, the answering machine was blinking. 2 messages from acquaintances, one from my niece asking about the funeral arrangements, and one from the lawyer reminding me to sign a release form. The ordinariness of it all made me furious. The world went on categorizing me as a widow, not as a woman whose entire identity had been rewritten. I poured a glass of wine, something I rarely did before, and sat at the kitchen table watching the dusk slide across the walls. The shadows lengthened like fingers, and for the first time I felt a dangerous calm. There was nothing left to protect, no image to preserve. I could finally stop pretending. The next morning, I woke earlier than usual, before the sun had risen. The air was heavy with the smell of damp earth after night rain. I dressed, pulled on my coat, and took the folder of documents with me. I walked through the still sleeping streets toward the bank, the same one where Derek and I had opened our first joint account decades ago. The manager was a young woman with a polished smile and kind eyes that did not quite know how to hide pity. She explained that she could not give me information on the secondary account without authorization, and I almost laughed at the absurdity of it. The man was dead, the lies were public, yet bureaucracy still bowed to his memory. I thanked her and left. As I stepped out into the street, a delivery truck passed, spraying a fine mist of water onto my shoes, and I realized that even the city didn't know who I was anymore. A widow, a fool, an inconvenient remainder of someone else's choices. At home, I made a decision that startled me with its clarity. I would not live surrounded by his things, not as an act of rage, but as an act of reclamation. I began in his study. Every photograph, every award, every object that bore his careful handwriting went into boxes. It was almost meditative, this sorting. Love in one pile, deceit in another, and a large middle pile for what could not be categorized. When I reached the bookshelf, I found a leather-bound journal, its spine cracked, its pages filled in his slanted hand. It wasn't a diary exactly, more of a collection of notes, thoughts, bits of unfinished letters. I read them standing by the window, the light gray and indifferent. In between ordinary remarks about business trips and the weather, there were fragments addressed to no one. She deserves better than my cowardice. If truth is a kindness, why does it feel like cruelty? One day, when the time comes, I will tell her everything. I realized then that he had lived not only a double life, but a divided conscience, always preparing for honesty, never arriving at it. The tragedy wasn't only his betrayal of me, but his failure to become the man he imagined himself to be. By evening, I had packed 5 boxes. The living room looked stripped, skeletal, like a theater after the audience has left. I ordered a simple meal from the cafe in town and ate in silence, the kind of silence that felt earned rather than imposed. It occurred to me that I hadn't actually spoken aloud to anyone in days. My voice, when I tested it, sounded older than I remembered, rough at the edges. Maybe grief changes tone, not volume. The following day, Laura called. Her number appeared on the phone, unfamiliar, yet already memorized by some reluctant part of me. I almost didn't answer, but curiosity has a way of overriding pride. She wanted to know if I had seen the papers Derek left behind. Her voice trembled slightly, and I wondered if she feared I might retaliate, demand something, make her life as difficult as mine had become. I told her I had found enough to understand the situation. There was a long pause. Then she said, "He wanted to make sure you were taken care of." I almost laughed again. The phrase was so male in its generosity, taking care of women as though we were fragile heirlooms that might shatter if left unattended. I replied evenly, "He succeeded. I'm taken care of. Too well, maybe." She didn't respond, only whispered, "I'm sorry," before hanging up. That night, I didn't dream of hallways or doors. I dreamed of a train station, of people leaving and arriving, and I was standing in the middle, unsure which direction was mine. The next morning, I understood the dream as clearly as if someone had translated it. I had to move, physically move, or I would rot in this mausoleum of half-truths. I packed a small suitcase, just clothes, my journal, and the photograph of me at 23, the one he always said he loved because I looked ready for the world. I left everything else behind. The train to the nearest city was nearly empty. I sat by the window watching the fields blur into streaks of green and brown. For the first time in weeks, my chest loosened. I didn't know what I would do, where I would stay, or what I was even looking for, but movement itself felt like recovery. I checked into a modest hotel by the river and spent 2 nights there, walking aimlessly through unfamiliar streets. No one knew me as a wife or widow. I was just another woman with gray hair and steady steps. In the anonymity of strangers, I found something close to peace. On the second evening, I returned to my room and opened the window. The city lights shimmered on the water below, and I thought about how many versions of Derek might still exist in other people's memories. To them, he would remain the charming colleague, the devoted husband, the man who paid for drinks and told stories. I couldn't rewrite those perceptions, nor did I want to. My task now was simpler and harder, to retrieve myself from the rubble of his mythology. I whispered his name once, not as prayer, but as farewell. The sound dissolved into the hum of distant traffic. When I returned home 2 days later, the house no longer felt haunted. It was merely empty. The difference was profound. I opened all the windows, letting the salt air sweep through, carrying the last traces of his scent away. I didn't know what tomorrow would hold, but for the first time, tomorrow felt like mine to decide. The morning I decided to visit the lawyer again began like any other, gray, indifferent, the kind of day that smells faintly of wet iron and resignation. I had returned from my brief escape to the city with a curious sort of steadiness, not peace exactly, but a tolerance for the absence of answers. Still, the silence of the house pressed on me with an almost physical weight, and I found myself needing to know what, precisely, Derek had built behind my back. The first time I had spoken to the lawyer, I'd been too stunned to ask the right questions. Now I wanted facts, not sympathy. Facts were cleaner, even if they cut. I dressed carefully, not for vanity, but for armor. A pressed blouse, dark skirt, the small pearl earrings Derek once said made me look respectable. Respectability had been my uniform for too long, and I wore it that day like a disguise. The office smelled of disinfectant and paper, the kind of modern sterility that insists on professionalism while erasing warmth. The young lawyer greeted me with polite efficiency, his eyes sliding away from mine, as though grief might be contagious. He gestured for me to sit, opened a folder, and began explaining with the practiced neutrality of someone trained to translate betrayal into legal language. There were, he said, multiple accounts under Derek's name, some joint, some private, all legitimate, but not all disclosed. The trust for the child, he confirmed, had been established 8 years ago, and continued until Derek's death. He had designated both me and the child as beneficiaries, though in vastly unequal portions. The numbers themselves didn't matter. What mattered was what they implied. Every dollar transferred had been time stolen, affection redirected, a life partitioned into secret compartments. I listened without reaction, nodding at intervals, signing where he indicated. My face was the same calm mask it had learned to be after years of polite dinner parties and rehearsed smiles. When he finished, he looked relieved, as though expecting an outburst that never came. "Is there anything else you'd like me to handle, Mrs. Grant?" he asked, his tone tentative, deferential. I heard myself answer before I had fully formed the thought. "Yes, I'd like copies of all documents related to the trust, every signature, every note." His eyebrows lifted slightly, but he complied, printing the papers and sliding them across the desk. I gathered them into my folder, thanked him, and walked out into the gray afternoon. Outside, the air smelled of rain, that clean metallic scent that precedes a storm. I didn't go straight home. My feet carried me instead toward the park across the street, a narrow stretch of trees and benches bordering the river. I sat beneath a maple tree, the leaves trembling in the wind, and spread the papers across my lap. I read every line slowly, tracing his handwriting, his initials, his careful instructions to ensure the child's welfare. The precision of his concern was unbearable. He had been meticulous in arranging comfort for them, yet never once considered what comfort meant for me. And yet, buried among the legal jargon, I found a sentence that stopped me. Primary trustee to inform Mrs. Elaine Grant of the trust's existence upon my death. It wasn't meant to be a secret forever. Perhaps he had planned, at the end, to tell me, to confess, to leave the truth behind, like a bequest, but that intention had died with him, leaving only the execution of an unspoken apology. For the first time since the funeral, I felt something shift inside me. Not forgiveness, not even compassion, but curiosity. I folded the papers and sat there a long while, watching the clouds thicken. I thought of the boy, Thomas, his name written neatly on every page, and wondered what Derek had been to him. A father of stories, of weekend visits, of promises. Did the boy know about me? Did he understand that his father's love had come at the expense of another life? I imagined his confusion, his innocence, and to my surprise, a strange tenderness rose in me, small but insistent. It was not his fault that he existed. He was simply the evidence of a man's hunger for something beyond his reach. The thought startled me. I had not expected empathy to survive in me. It felt like discovering a faint heartbeat in a body presumed dead. I left the park as rain began to fall, soft at first, then steady, soaking my hair in sleeves. By the time I reached the house, I was dripping but calm. I made tea, sat by the window, and opened my notebook. I had not written in weeks. My pen hovered over the page, as I wondered what a woman like me could possibly say that hadn't already been said in sighs or silences. But then a sentence formed, quiet and certain, for the boy who does not know the cost of his inheritance. That was how the letter began. I didn't address it to his mother, or to Derek, or even to the past. I addressed it to the child who had stood at the funeral with confusion in his eyes, who had unknowingly called my husband Dad. I wrote about kindness, not Derek's kind, the soft deceit of care that conceals control, but the real kind, the one that demands truth even when it hurts. I told him that people are not divided neatly into villains and saints, that his father was both brave and afraid, generous and selfish, capable of love yet incapable of honesty. I didn't write it to ease my pain. I wrote it because the truth, once spoken, belongs to everyone it touches. When I finished, the page was damp with the light sweat of my palms. I folded it carefully, placed it in an envelope, and wrote his name on the front. I had no intention of sending it yet. It was enough that it existed. The act of writing it had changed something fundamental in me. I realized that for decades I had measured my life in relation to Derek, his moods, his work, his health, his happiness. I had made my world orbit his, mistaking loyalty for love and silence for strength. But sitting there, with the rain streaking the windows and the sea beyond them roaring its endless indifference, I felt a peculiar freedom, not joy, not even hope, but the quiet permission to exist independently of him. That evening, I decided to visit the cemetery. It was nearly dusk when I arrived, the sky bruised purple and gold, the earth damp from the afternoon rain. His grave was still fresh, the mound of soil darker than the others, the flowers already wilting. I stood there, hands clasped, not praying, just observing. "You've managed it," I said aloud. "You've made sure we're all taking care of your mess." The wind carried my voice across the stones, and I imagined him somewhere, smiling that self-assured smile he wore when he thought he had solved everything. "I hope you're satisfied," I added, though the words sounded childish. After a while, I took a deep breath and said what I had come to say. "You don't get to define me anymore." It wasn't dramatic, just true. The sentence hung there in the fading light, final and liberating. On the way home, I stopped by the post office. I bought a small packet of envelopes and stamps, then hesitated at the counter. The clerk, a woman about my age with tired eyes, smiled absently and asked if I wanted anything else. I almost told her the whole story right there, as strangers sometimes do, but instead I said, "Yes, one more thing. A notebook, please." She handed me a plain one with a blue cover. "For letters?" she asked. I nodded. "Yes, for letters." That night I began to write more, not just to the boy, but to myself, to the woman I had been at 20, at 40, at 60. I wrote to the version of me that believed in endurance as virtue, to the one who mistook compliance for grace. Each sentence felt like excavation, pulling bones of truth from soil long packed down. I didn't cry. The tears had dried somewhere along the way. What remained was clarity, sharp and luminous. I began to understand that survival isn't the absence of pain, but the ability to give that pain new shape, to mold it into something that belongs to you rather than to the one who caused it. When I finally went to bed, the letter to the boy lay on my desk, unsent but alive. The house was quiet, but not empty. It was filled with the soft, invisible movement of something returning to life. Me. It was a Sunday when she came again. That woman with her quiet face and her hands that never seemed to know where to rest. I heard the knock just after midday, soft but insistent. The kind of knock that carries the memory of hesitation. I had been sitting at the kitchen table rereading the letter I had written to the boy, the one I still hadn't sent. The paper was slightly creased at the corners now, as if it had absorbed too much of my indecision. The sound of her knuckles on the door startled me more than it should have, and for a moment I thought of pretending not to be home. But then, as so often happens when we've already been wounded as deeply as we can be, a strange courage took over. I went to the door and opened it, and there she was, standing on my porch like a woman returning to a crime scene. Behind her, at the edge of the path, stood the boy, dressed neatly in a pale sweater, holding a bouquet of flowers that were clearly chosen by someone else. The wind lifted a strand of his hair, and for a moment it was like seeing Derek as a child, the same tilt of the head, the same unguarded openness. "I hope I'm not intruding," she said, her voice low, almost apologetic. "Thomas wanted to see you. He said he didn't get to say goodbye properly at the funeral." Her words were measured, cautious, as though she had rehearsed them many times. I looked at the boy, then back at her. There was no malice in her face, only exhaustion, the kind that seeps into a person when their life has been built on waiting. "All right," I said finally, stepping aside. "You might as well come in." They entered the house slowly, the way people do, when they know the air inside is heavy with ghosts. The boy handed me the flowers, awkwardly, but with sincerity. "They're from our garden," he said, proud of the offering. They were lilies, the same kind Derek used to buy for me every spring. I thanked him and placed them in a vase, filling it with water that ran cold over my fingers. "You have a lovely garden," I said, and he smiled, unaware of the echo those words carried. Laura, she had told me her name once, but it had taken me time to use it, sat at the edge of the armchair, her back straight, her coat still buttoned. I offered tea, more from habit than hospitality. As I poured, she spoke quietly. "I wanted to thank you," she said, "for not contesting the will. I know you would have every right to. I just wanted you to know I appreciate it." Her voice trembled slightly, but she steadied it with a deep breath. I looked at her, this woman who had lived a parallel life to mine, who had carried Derek's affection in secret while I carried his public respect. I could see now that she wasn't the enemy I had once imagined, not a temptress or a thief, but simply another woman who had been promised permanence by a man who didn't understand what permanence meant. "I didn't do it for you," I said finally, "or for him. I did it because fighting over what's already gone is just another way of staying trapped." She nodded, her eyes glistening, but she didn't argue. There was relief in her silence and a kind of shared fatigue. Thomas wandered into the hallway, curious, his small footsteps soft against the wooden floor. He stopped in front of a framed photograph on the console table. Derek and me on our wedding day, both of us absurdly young and bright with expectation. The boy pointed to it. "That's my dad," he said proudly. Then, after a moment's pause, he looked at me and added, "He said you were his friend." The word struck me like a stone. Friend. That was the category Derek had given me in the story he told his son, the neat erasure of 50 years. I didn't correct him. Children shouldn't be burdened with the sins of their parents. I only smiled faintly and said, "Yes, we were friends for a very long time." Laura turned away, her face pale. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, but I shook my head. "Don't be." He was clever with words. He made them fit whatever world he needed at the moment. The boy had already lost interest in our grown-up confusion. He had found the old piano in the corner and was pressing random keys, the sound discordant but somehow soothing. The notes lingered in the air like small uncertain truths. We sat there for a long time, the three of us bound together by absence. Eventually Laura began to speak again, haltingly at first, then with increasing urgency, as though confession were the only currency she had left. She told me how she met him, how he charmed her, not with grand gestures, but with attention, the kind that feels like sunlight after a long winter. She spoke of the years spent waiting for promises, of birthdays half celebrated, of the boy's questions she couldn't fully answer. "He said he loved us both," she said finally, "but differently. I used to think that made it noble somehow. Now I just think it made it easy for him." I listened without interruption. Her words were not news, but hearing them spoken aloud gave them shape, texture. I could see Derek in those stories, the same restless kindness, the same fear of confrontation disguised as tenderness. When she finished, she looked at me as if expecting judgment. Instead, I said, "He loved being needed. We both gave him that. That's what he couldn't give up." She nodded slowly, her shoulders lowering in a gesture that looked almost like relief. Thomas returned to the room holding a small seashell he'd found on the windowsill. "Can I keep this?" he asked. "It's pretty." I looked at the shell, one of many Derek and I had collected years ago on the same beach, where, I now realized, he must have walked with them too. "Of course," I said. "It's meant to be found." He grinned and slipped it into his pocket, and I felt something in my chest loosen, just slightly. Perhaps some fragments of the past can be released without ceremony. When they left, the house felt different. Not heavier, as I'd expected, but strangely hollowed out, as if a long clenched space had finally been exhaled. I washed the cups, dried them carefully, and went to sit by the window. The sea was restless that afternoon, dark and glittering, under a sky that couldn't decide between sun and rain. I thought about what it meant to live after being deceived for so long, to carry memories that no longer belonged fully to me. It would have been easy to retreat into bitterness, to let his shadow define the rest of my life, but something in me resisted. Perhaps it was the boy's smile, or the quiet dignity in Laura's apology, or maybe just the exhaustion of carrying resentment for so long. Whatever it was, it whispered that survival wasn't about forgetting, but about reclaiming the right to interpret what remained. In the following weeks, the world began to intrude again. Letters from the bank, calls from friends, polite invitations to social gatherings I had no interest in attending. I declined them all. I spent my days walking along the shore, collecting fragments of driftwood and sea glass, arranging them on the windowsill where the light could catch them. I found a kind of meditation in the repetition, the endless sorting of broken things into something almost beautiful. Each evening I would write a little more in my notebook, sometimes a letter to my younger self, sometimes a line addressed to Derek, though I no longer believed he could hear me. Writing became the way I measured my own heartbeat. One afternoon, while walking through the market, I saw Laura again. She was with Thomas, buying bread. She didn't see me at first, but when she did, she froze, uncertain. I walked over before she could decide whether to flee. "How have you been?" I asked, surprising both of us with the simplicity of the question. She smiled tentatively. "Better, I think. He talks about you sometimes." My heart skipped. "About me?" "He says you're brave," she replied. "That you didn't get angry." I wasn't sure whether to laugh or cry. Children always create myths to protect the people they love. "He's kind," I said. "That's rarer than bravery." Before we parted, she handed me a folded piece of paper. "I found this among his things," she said. "I think it belongs to you." It was a letter, written in Derek's handwriting, addressed simply to E. My hands trembled as I took it, but I didn't open it there. I waited until I was home, sitting once again at the kitchen table. The envelope was yellowed slightly, as though it had waited a long time to be discovered. I unfolded the page and read. The words were typical of him, measured, eloquent, evasive. He wrote of gratitude, of memories, of the life we had built. But between the lines, I sensed what he couldn't say. Guilt, regret, the knowledge that truth had come too late. One sentence stood out. "You were always the part of my life that felt like home, even when I couldn't live there anymore." I read it twice, feeling neither comfort nor pain, just recognition. It was the closest he would ever come to honesty. That night, I took both letters, his and mine, and placed them side by side on the table. His words looked fragile, already fading. Mine, written in darker ink, seemed steadier, anchored. I thought about burning his, but decided against it. Let the lies and the truths coexist. One no longer had power over the other. Instead, I slipped them into an old box with photographs and small keepsakes, then closed the lid gently, as one might close the door on a sleeping child. The next morning, I woke early, before dawn, and walked to the garden. The lilies Thomas had brought me were still in bloom, their scent sharp in the cool air. I crouched beside them and dug a small hole near the roots. From my pocket, I took Derek's wedding ring, the one I'd removed from his finger before the burial and kept in a drawer, unable to decide what to do with it. It glinted faintly in the dim light, a small circle of promises and betrayals. I placed it in the hole, covered it with soil, and pressed my palm against the earth. The gesture was simple, almost ceremonial. "Stay there," I whispered. "You've traveled enough." When I stood up, the sky had begun to brighten, the first streaks of pink stretching across the horizon. I felt tired, but it was a clean kind of tiredness, the kind that comes after hard labor. I went inside, made coffee, and stood by the window watching the day arrive. I realized I no longer felt the need to explain anything, not to him, not to her, not even to myself. The story had ended, and I was still here. That, in itself, felt miraculous. Later that week, I received a small envelope in the mail. No return address, just my name written in a child's uneven handwriting. Inside was a short note. Thank you for the shell. Mom says it's from your beach. I keep it on my desk. It sounds like the ocean when you hold it to your ear. I hope you're okay. Beneath the words was a drawing of a wave, clumsy and tender. I smiled for the first time in months, a real smile that reached my eyes. I placed the note beside my teacup and listened to the sound of the sea outside, the endless rhythm that had once mocked me, but now felt like a companion. I realized then that perhaps redemption doesn't come in grand gestures or forgiveness, but in small exchanges of truth, in the quiet inheritance of understanding passed from one heart to another. The boy's letter lay open on the table as the light shifted through the window. The world outside was still flawed, still full of unfinished stories, but for the first time, it felt livable. I touched the edge of the paper and whispered his name softly, not out of grief or longing, but out of a strange maternal tenderness. The sea kept breathing beyond the walls, and I breathed with it, steady, unafraid, alive. The decision did not arrive as thunder or revelation. It came on an ordinary Tuesday morning when the kettle clicked off and the house, as if cued by some invisible conductor, fell into one of those dense, humming silences that force you to hear your own thoughts. I stood by the sink, holding Thomas's little letter in one hand and my mug in the other, and realized with an almost physical clarity that I could not keep living inside a building that had been constructed as a monument to someone else's version of me. Every room in that house carried his fingerprints and my obedience. The floral curtains he liked, the heavy dining table bought for entertaining, the framed photographs chosen to display a life that looked whole from the outside. Even after I'd put his things away in boxes, the architecture itself still spoke his language. The study where he closed the door to make phone calls, the hall where I'd waited for him to come home late from meetings, the bedroom where I had learned to measure my worth and how quietly I could absorb his distance. The realization was simple and cruelly practical. If I stayed here, I would forever be the curator of his museum, dust in glass cases around a story that no longer belonged to me. I finished my tea, rinsed the cup, dried it with careful hands. Habits die ceremonially. And then I called the real estate agent, whose flyers had annoyed me for years. I told her my name, my address, and that I was ready to sell. There was a small pause on the line, then a professional brightness as she began talking about valuations and market conditions, square footage and ocean views, as if I had just notified her of a business opportunity rather than the dismantling of a life. I listened, answered her questions, scheduled the visit. When I hung up, my hand was shaking, but not from fear. It was the tremor that follows a tourniquet finally being cut loose. The process began with photographs. A polite young man came to capture the house in wide angles and flattering light, instructing me to remove personal items so buyers could imagine themselves here. I almost laughed at the unintentional mercy of that request. I had spent 5 decades erasing myself to make room for Derek's comfort, and now, in order to leave, I was being asked to erase the last traces of us both. I walked through each room, taking down frames, folding blankets, removing the small domestic evidences that said a particular woman had lived here and tried her best. When I reached the study, I hesitated only for a breath before sliding Derek's degree off the wall. The nail left a tiny, empty hole, like a healed piercing. The young man admired the view from the living room window, commented on how lucky I must feel to wake up to the sea every day. I smiled politely and didn't tell him that the same view had watched me overlook every red flag, as if waves themselves could bless a lie. Once the listing went up, neighbors began to appear at my door with their weaponized curiosity masked as concern. "Are you sure, Elaine? So many memories here." And I learned to answer with a calm that surprised them. "Yes," I would say, "it's time for something smaller." They would tilt their heads with that particular look, people reserved for women who outlive their scripts, but none of them argued. Offers came quickly. Apparently, the house Derek had so proudly called his legacy property was desirable to people who saw only hardwood floors and coastline. When I signed the final documents, the same lawyer who had walked me through the will guided me through this transfer, his tone once again neutral, almost reverent toward my decisiveness. The proceeds, he confirmed, would leave me more than secure for the rest of my life. "Have you thought about what you'd like to do?" he asked, as if planning vacations. I had thought about it. I had been thinking about little else. "Yes," I said, "I'd like to establish a small fund, in my name, for girls who were taught to make themselves small." His pen paused, then moved again. And there it was, the Elaine Grant Fellowship, modest but real, a line of text that redirected a portion of Derek's carefully hoarded security away from the maintenance of his myth and toward the possibility that some young woman, somewhere, might choose truth faster than I did. It wasn't revenge, it was redistribution, a quiet theft from the narrative that had positioned him as the benevolent architect of our lives. The day I left the house for the last time, the sky was clear, an open, rinsed blue that made every edge of the world look sharper. There were no violins, no witnesses, only the removal van rumbling away and my 2 suitcases standing obediently by the front door. I walked through each room slowly, not to indulge sentimentality, but to recognize the reality of what I was doing. In the bedroom, I ran a hand along the empty surface of the dresser where his cufflinks once lay, acknowledging aloud that this was where I had betrayed myself longest, mistaking absence for dignity. In the hallway, I touched the groove in the wall where we'd once scraped moving furniture in, remembering how we'd laughed and promised we'd grow old here, never imagining that promises can decay too. In the kitchen, I opened the drawer where his useless one-sentence letter had rested before I fed it to the sink, and felt an odd relief that there was nothing left to keep or destroy. I stepped out into the garden one last time. The lilies Thomas had given me were gone now, replaced by fresh shoots and stubborn weeds. Beneath the soil near their old place lay Derek's ring, unseen, unremarked. I did not dig it up. Some symbols belonged to the earth. At the gate, with the keys cold in my palm, I thought of the life that had been lived behind me and the parallel one I might have had if either of us had been brave earlier. Instead of collapsing under the weight of that thought, I simply locked the door, placed the keys in a plain envelope for the new owners, and slid it through the mail slot. The sound of them landing on the floor inside was small, almost absurdly so, but I felt it in my bones. Something irrevocable had just been done. I moved into a modest apartment 2 streets back from the sea, a place with thin walls, uneven floors, and sun that spilled generously across the table in the mornings. It smelled of fresh paint and other people's beginnings. No one here knew me as Derek's wife. To the landlord, I was simply Mrs. Grant, retired, quiet, pays on time. I bought myself a second-hand table, a comfortable chair, 2 plates, 1 good pan, and a new kettle that whistled too eagerly. The first night I sat on the floor with my dinner balanced on my knees and felt not lonely, but strangely upright, like furniture finally untethered from the wrong wall. A few days later, I went back to the lawyer with one more document I had drafted myself, each sentence chosen with care. It stated, in clear, formal language, that I was of sound mind, living independently, not under pressure or guardianship, fully in control of my finances and decisions, and that any third-party attempts, by family or others, to question that would be treated as harassment. He read it, looked up at me with something close to respect, and said, "You are entitled to set these boundaries." He notarized it. I left with the stamped pages in my bag, not because I expected a war, but because I had spent too many years being the one person in my own life without legal or emotional protection. This was my line in the sand, inked instead of spoken, enforceable instead of implied. That evening, in my new kitchen, I took out my notebook and added another letter. Not to Derek, not to Thomas, not to Laura, but to myself. I wrote that I had finally done something that could not be undone in the next apology or the next compromise, that I had chosen a version of my life where my worth was not collateral in someone else's secrets. I wrote that if fear came later, as it always does, I was to remember this day, the locked door, the signed forms, the sunlight on the cheap linoleum as I boiled water in a home that contained no lies. When I finished, I did not cry. I opened the window instead and listened to a city that did not know me breathe and move, full of strangers making choices, some brave, some foolish, all their own. For the first time, I understood that my story had a center, and it was not a man's name. The first weeks in the new apartment unfolded with a gentleness I hadn't anticipated. It was as if the world, after years of holding its breath around me, had exhaled. The mornings arrived without obligation. I would wake to the sound of gulls and the faint clatter of a neighbor's window being opened, the smell of coffee drifting from someone else's kitchen. I no longer dressed for anyone's expectations. I wore what felt like me, simple clothes, soft and forgiving. The sea, though I couldn't see it from here, was still close enough to taste in the air. I would walk there sometimes, not out of nostalgia, but because its restlessness matched my own and made me feel less like an aberration. There was something almost tender in the way the waves kept returning, relentless, yet without apology. I had come to understand that constancy was not the same as loyalty. Sometimes it was just repetition, mistaken for faith. I spent my days reading, writing, and tending to the few plants I'd brought with me. The apartment filled slowly with small, deliberate objects, a clay bowl from a local market, a lamp whose warm light made the evenings seem less lonely, a painting of a single chair on an empty beach. I didn't rush to fill the silence. It was a new kind of silence, one that didn't accuse. I could feel the old life shedding itself quietly, like a skin that had grown too tight. The pain hadn't disappeared. It had simply changed its rhythm, no longer sharp but steady, a background hum that reminded me of endurance rather than loss. There were moments, of course, when I felt the old ache return, a song on the radio, a scent of cologne in passing, but even those moments felt less like wounds and more like faint weather, something that would pass if I waited. One afternoon, a small envelope arrived, addressed in careful, uneven handwriting. I knew before opening it who it was from. Inside was another note from Thomas. He wrote that he had started secondary school, that he had joined the music club and was learning the piano. He said he kept the shell by his window and listened to it on nights when he missed his father, that sometimes he imagined me listening to the same ocean and that it made him feel less alone. The letter ended with a single line. I hope you're okay now. I read it several times, each reading gentler than the last. The boy's kindness was simple and unburdened, untouched by the adult need to define or justify. It was just concern, freely given. I placed the letter on my desk beside my notebook, and for the first time, I allowed myself to cry. Not for Derek, not even for the years I had lost, but for the quiet beauty of being seen without expectation. Later that evening, as dusk settled and the streetlights flickered on, I made tea and sat by the window. The city's noise was soft here. Distant laughter, a car turning a corner, the whisper of wind against the glass. I thought about the scholarship fund, about the young women who might one day receive that small sum of money and use it to step outside a life that tried to define them. Perhaps they would never know my story. Perhaps they would never imagine the gray-haired woman who signed the documents in an office scented with ink and finality. But that was all right. The gesture was enough. I didn't need recognition. I needed consequence. Derek had once told me that legacy was the mark you leave on others' memories. He had been wrong. Legacy is the choice that outlives the damage you survived. Sometimes, when the nights stretched long, I would take out my old letters, the ones I had written to myself, the ones addressed to no one in particular, and read them as if they belonged to another woman. In a way, they did. I could hardly recognize the voice that once trembled with disbelief, the tone that mistook endurance for virtue. I kept them as evidence of transformation, not shame. To see where you have been is to understand the ground beneath your feet. The woman who had walked through betrayal and silence, who had buried a ring in her garden and locked the door of her former life, was not gone. She had simply stepped aside to make room for the one who could live without pretending. In early spring, I visited the old neighborhood once more. The new owners had repainted the house a pale yellow, replaced the curtains, filled the garden with different flowers. It looked lighter, almost innocent. I stood across the street, unseen, and felt no resentment, only distance. It belonged to another story now, and that was a kind of mercy. I walked down to the beach where Derek and I had once stood decades ago, when the world still seemed infinite. The tide was low, and the sand was cool beneath my shoes. I knelt and pressed my palm to it, not as farewell, but as acknowledgement. We were real, I whispered to the air. Even the lies were real while we lived inside them. The wind carried the words away, scattering them like salt. I stayed there until the light faded, then turned back toward the road, toward the small life waiting for me, the one I had built with both hands after everything collapsed. Now, when I look in the mirror, I see a woman who is not young, not unscarred, but unmistakably alive. My reflection no longer startles me. The lines on my face are not remnants of sorrow, but evidence of having endured it. Sometimes I think about writing again, not letters, but a story, mine, though I'm not sure I would name him at all. Maybe I would write about a house by the sea, and a woman who learned that silence can be both prison and freedom, depending on who owns it. Maybe I would end it with her sitting by a window, watching gulls rise into the fading light, and realizing that survival, at its most honest, is not triumph, but persistence with grace. Before bed, I often open the window wide and let the night air drift in. Somewhere far off, the ocean breathes, endless and indifferent. I no longer need it to forgive me, or him, or anyone. I only need it to keep moving, as I do. I close my notebook, turn off the lamp, and whisper into the dark, not as plea, but as benediction. I am here. The words do not echo, They don't need to. They settle quietly into the room, into the life that is finally entirely my own,